The Galactic Concord had ruled the stars for 12,000 years, and in all that time, nothing had truly changed. 847 species lived under its laws, trading goods and sharing knowledge across 1,000,000 worlds, but they had forgotten something important along the way. They had forgotten how to care about anything beyond themselves. The Concord was built on logic and efficiency, on treaties that demanded nothing and promised even less, and every species had learned to mind their own business, to calculate costs and benefits, to watch disasters unfold on distant worlds without lifting a single finger to help. This was the way of the galaxy, cold and rational and utterly without mercy. Ambassador Yelthani of the Varath had served the Concord for 60 years, and she had always believed in its wisdom, always trusted that the Great Coalition would protect its members when darkness came. But now, she stood before the Supreme Assembly with tears running down her pale blue face, and she finally understood the terrible truth. Her people were going to die, and nobody cared. The Varath homeworld orbited a yellow star called Velkith, a star that astronomers had studied for centuries and declared stable for another 5 billion years. But something had gone wrong, something the scientists could not explain, and now Velkith was dying. A gravitational cascade, they called it, a rare phenomenon that caused stars to collapse centuries ahead of schedule, and the timeline was not measured in years or decades but in months. 40 billion Varath lived on their beautiful world, a planet of vast oceans and coral cities that had taken 10,000 years to build, and all of it would be gone within a single rotation around their dying sun. Yelthani had come to the Concord begging for help, pleading for evacuation ships and emergency resources, and the Assembly had listened to her words with polite attention before delivering their verdict. "We have reviewed your request," the Supreme Chancellor had announced, his voice carrying no emotion whatsoever, "and we must inform you that a full-scale evacuation is not feasible at this time." Not feasible. 40 billion lives hung in the balance, and the mightiest civilization in galactic history had declared it not feasible. Yelthani had demanded an explanation, her voice rising with desperate fury, and the Chancellor had provided one with the patience of someone explaining simple mathematics to a child. The logistics were impractical, he said, because moving 40 billion people required more ships than the Concord could spare without disrupting trade routes. The cost-benefit analysis was unfavorable, he continued, because the resources required for such an operation would strain multiple economies. And besides, he concluded, the Varath had been given adequate warning to make their own arrangements. Adequate warning. They had learned of their doom only 3 months ago, and the Chancellor spoke as if that was enough time to build an evacuation fleet from nothing. Yelthani had looked around the great chamber, searching the faces of 100 different species for any sign of compassion, any hint that someone might speak up against this madness, but she found only cold indifference. The Molvari delegates studied their data tablets. The Keithrani representative whispered among themselves about shipping contracts. The ancient Vorthax elders simply closed their many eyes and waited for the session to end. Nobody would help, and nobody would even pretend to be sorry about it. "Is this truly the will of the Concord?" Yelthani asked, her voice breaking with grief and rage combined. "This is the rational response to an unfortunate natural circumstance," the Chancellor replied, "and the Concord wishes your people peace in their final days." Peace. As if peace could save her children from a dying star. As if peace could rebuild the coral cities, or preserve 10,000 years of art and poetry and love. Yelthani walked out of the assembly chamber that day knowing that her people had been sentenced to death by bureaucratic indifference, and she returned to her quarters to compose a final message. She sat before the communication screen for a long time, trying to find the right words, and when she finally spoke, Her voice carried the weight of a civilization facing extinction. "This message is for anyone who can hear it," she began. "Anyone in this vast and terrible galaxy who still remembers what it means to help those in need." She described the coming disaster, the dying star and the doomed world and the billions who would perish, and she did not hide her anger at the conquered's refusal to act. "We are not asking for charity," she said, "and we are not asking for miracles. We are simply asking if there is anyone at all, who believes that 40 billion lives are worth trying to save." She paused, and tears fell freely down her face. "If you can hear this message, please answer. Please show us that the galaxy is not as cold and empty as it seems tonight." The transmission went out across 10,000 worlds, carried by relay stations and communication networks that the conquered had built over millennia, and most species ignored it entirely. The Mulvari classified it as emotional propaganda. The Keithrani marked it as a low-priority cultural document. The Vorthax did not even bother to acknowledge its receipt. But on one small world, orbiting an unremarkable yellow star at the edge of explored space, something different happened. A dock worker in a city called New Singapore was eating his lunch when the transmission appeared on his screen, and he stopped chewing and watched the whole thing with growing horror. A teacher in a place called Lagos was preparing her lesson when a student showed her the message, and she sat down heavily in her chair and began to weep. A retired military officer in Sao Paulo heard the broadcast on his morning news program, and his hands began to shake with an emotion he had not felt in 20 years. Across a planet called Earth, 9 billion members of a young and troublesome species watched Ambassador Yelthani beg for help, and something ancient stirred in their collective heart. They were called humans, and they had joined the Galactic Conquered only 60 years ago, and the elder species considered them emotional and irrational and far too quick to anger. The humans had a word for what they felt as they watched the Varath ambassador plead for her people's lives. They called it fury. Not the cold and calculated anger that the conquered understood, not the rational displeasure that came from disrupted trade agreements or violated protocols, but something older and wilder and infinitely more dangerous. This was the fury that had driven their ancestor to charge into burning building to save strangers. This was the fury that had made them build hospitals in war zones and share their food with enemies. This was the fury that refused to accept impractical as an answer when children were dying. The Galactic Conquered had spent 12,000 years learning to suppress such emotions, considering them primitive and counterproductive, but humans had never learned that lesson. And now, as the stars themselves turned their backs on the Varath, humanity remembered what it meant to rage against the darkness. The message spread across Earth like wildfire, shared and reshared until every human alive had seen the pale blue face of Ambassador Yelthani. And in government offices and military bases and ordinary homes, people began asking the same question: what are we going to do about this? The answer would shake the galaxy to its foundations. The United Earth Parliament had not seen a session like this in 50 years. Representatives from every nation on the planet filled the great chamber, their faces grim and their voices loud, and the arguments had been going on for nearly 10 hours without pause. Some said that humanity should stay out of this crisis, that the conquered had made its decision, and Earth had no business interfering in galactic politics. Others argued that the cost was simply too high, that humans did not have the ships or the resources to evacuate an entire planet, and that trying would only lead to disaster. But a third group refused to accept either answer, and they grew louder with every passing hour. "We have heard enough excuses," declared Representative Chen of the Pacific Federation, slamming her hand on her desk so hard that the sound echoed through the chamber. 40 billion people are going to die, and we are sitting here debating logistics. "The logistics matter," replied Senator Morrison of the Atlantic Coalition, his voice tired and strained. "Because we cannot save people we cannot reach. Our fleet is not designed for this kind of operation." "Then we redesign it," Chen shot back, "or we find another way. Or we try something that has never been tried before. But we do not sit here and do nothing while an entire civilization burns." The debate might have continued for another 10 hours, but then the doors of the chamber opened and Fleet Admiral Kira Okonkwo walked in. She was a tall woman with gray hair and dark skin, and she had served in the Earth Defense Force for 40 years, and every person in that room knew her name. She had led the human fleet during the border conflicts, had negotiated the peace treaty with the Keithrani, had done more to establish humanity's place in the galaxy than any other living person. And now she walked to the speaker's podium without asking permission, and nobody tried to stop her. "I have been listening to this debate from my office," she said, her voice calm and steady, "and I have heard a great deal of talk about what we cannot do." She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of representatives who had been arguing for hours. "But I did not come here to tell you what is impossible. I came here to tell you what I am going to do." She activated the display screen behind her, showing a map of the galaxy with the Verath system highlighted in red. "The Verath homeworld is 6 weeks away at maximum speed," she explained, "and their star will become unstable in approximately 4 months. That gives us a window of 10 weeks to complete an evacuation." 10 weeks to move 40 billion people, someone called out, and the disbelief in their voice was obvious. 10 weeks to move as many people as we possibly can, Okonkwo corrected, because the alternative is to move none at all, and I refuse to accept that. She changed the display to show the current state of the human fleet, and the numbers were not encouraging. Earth had 112 military vessels capable of interstellar travel, and perhaps twice that number of civilian cargo ships. Even if every ship carried passengers instead of goods, they could transport maybe 200 million people, a tiny fraction of the Verath population. "The numbers do not work," admitted Admiral Okonkwo, "but numbers can change." She began outlining her plan, and as she spoke, the representatives slowly stopped arguing and started listening. Every cargo ship in human space would be converted to carry passengers, with temporary life support systems and emergency housing installed in cargo bays. Every mining vessel and transport shuttle would be pulled from their regular routes and sent to join the evacuation fleet. Private citizens who owned spacecraft would be asked to volunteer their vessels, with the government covering all fuel and maintenance costs. And most importantly, the entire operation would begin immediately, without waiting for approval from the Galactic Concord. "We will be breaking Concord protocols," Okonkwo admitted, "and there may be consequences for that. But I believe the Parliament will agree that some things are more important than protocols." The vote was held within the hour, and it was not even close. 437 representatives voted in favor of the evacuation mission, with only 23 opposed, and humanity officially declared its intention to save the Verath. But the vote was only the beginning, because now the real work had to start. Across Earth and the human colonies, people began to mobilize with a speed that amazed even the conquered observers who were watching from their distant stations. Factories that had been producing consumer goods switched overnight to manufacturing life support equipment. Shipyards that had been building luxury vessels began converting them into refugee transports. Universities sent their best engineers to help design emergency housing that could be installed in cargo bays within days instead of months. And ordinary people, the ones who did not own factories or shipyards, found their own ways to help. A restaurant owner in Mumbai organized a campaign to collect food supplies for the refugee ships. A clothing manufacturer in Berlin donated 10 million thermal blankets to keep Varath passengers warm during the journey. A children's hospital in Toronto sent doctors and nurses to train in Varath medical care, learning how to treat a species they had never met. Money poured in from every corner of human civilization, as people donated their savings to fuel the fleet. A retired teacher in Kenya gave her entire pension. A young programmer in Japan sold his apartment and sent every credit to the emergency fund. A group of university students in Brazil organized a fundraiser that collected more money in 1 week than the entire conquered budget for humanitarian aid. The elder species of the galaxy watched this chaos with confusion and concern. "The humans are being irrational," observed High Chancellor Vorthax of the Vorthax Dominion, his ancient voice crackling through the diplomatic channels. "They cannot possibly save all the Varath, and their attempt will only drain their own resources." "Perhaps they know something we do not," suggested Ambassador Melkin of the Molvari, though he did not sound convinced. "They know nothing," replied Vorthax, "except how to waste their energy on emotional gestures. This is why young species should not be given too much freedom." But the humans did not care what the elder species thought. They had seen the face of Ambassador Yalthani, had heard her voice breaking with grief, and they had made their choice. Admiral Okonkwo stood on the bridge of her flagship, the United Earth ship Defiance, and watched as the evacuation fleet assembled in orbit. 342 vessels of wildly different sizes and designs, crewed by soldiers and civilians and volunteers who had never flown in space before. It was not enough. She knew it was not enough, but it was everything humanity had. "Admiral," called her communications officer, "we have received a message from the Varath homeworld. Ambassador Yalthani is requesting to speak with you personally." Okonkwo nodded and activated the communication screen, and a moment later she was looking at the same pale blue face that had appeared on billions of human screens. "Admiral Okonkwo," Yalthani said, her voice trembling with emotion, "is it true? Is it true that you are coming to help us?" "It is true," Okonkwo replied, "and we will be there in 6 weeks. Please tell your people to be ready." "I do not understand," the ambassador whispered, and tears were falling down her face again. "Nobody has ever done this. Nobody has ever cared this much about strangers." Admiral Okonkwo smiled, and in that smile was all the fury and compassion and stubborn determination of 9 billion humans. "We are not strangers anymore," she said, "and we will not let you face this darkness alone." The fleet departed Earth orbit that very day, jumping into hyperspace with a roar of engines that could be heard across the solar system. Behind them, a planet of furious humans continued to work, building more ships and gathering more supplies, and refusing to accept that anything was impossible. The galaxy had never seen anything like it, and the galaxy would never be the same. The human fleet emerged from hyperspace above the Varath homeworld, and for a long moment, nobody on the bridge of the Defiance could speak. The planet was beautiful beyond words, a world of deep blue oceans and vast coral structures that glittered like jewels in the light of the dying star. But that star, that terrible, failing star, hung in the sky like a wound, its surface boiling with plasma storms and gravitational distortions that sent waves of radiation washing across the system. "Radiation levels are already dangerous," reported the science officer, his voice tight with concern, "and they will only get worse. We have maybe 8 weeks before the planet becomes completely uninhabitable." Admiral Okonkwo nodded grimly and activated the fleet-wide communication channel. "All ships, this is Admiral Okonkwo," she announced. "We have arrived at the Varath homeworld, and our mission begins now. I want every transport ready for landing within the hour, and I want evacuation zones established in every major population center." She paused and looked at the beautiful doomed world filling her view screen. These people have been told by the galaxy that their lives do not matter, she continued. And today we are going to prove the galaxy wrong. Let us get to work. The evacuation began like a symphony of controlled chaos. Human ships descended through the turbulent atmosphere, fighting against solar winds and radiation bursts to reach the surface. Transport captains who had spent their careers hauling cargo found themselves landing in the middle of crowded cities, surrounded by millions of frightened Verath who had never seen an alien vessel before. Captain Maria Santos of the cargo ship Esperanza was one of the first to touch down, and she would never forget what she saw when she opened her boarding ramp. Thousands of Verath stood waiting in perfect silence, their large dark eyes filled with a mixture of hope and disbelief. They were beautiful creatures, with smooth blue skin and delicate features, and many of them were carrying small children wrapped in colorful cloth. "My name is Captain Santos," she announced through her translation device, "and I am here to take you to safety. Please board in an orderly fashion, and do not worry about your belongings." For a moment, nobody moved. Then an elderly Verath stepped forward, his body trembling with age and emotion, and he reached out to touch Captain Santos on the arm. "You came," he whispered. "You actually came for us." "Of course we came," Santos replied, and she was surprised to find tears in her own eyes. "Now please, we do not have much time. Let us get your people aboard." The boarding began, slow at first but quickly gaining speed as the Verath realized this was not a dream. Families crowded up the ramps, clutching their most precious possessions, photographs and jewelry and small keepsakes that held the memories of generations. Children cried in confusion, not understanding why they had to leave their homes, and human crew members picked them up and carried them aboard with gentle words of comfort. "You are safe now," they said in halting Verath phrases they had learned during the journey. "We have you, everything will be all right." Across the planet, the same scene repeated itself 1,000 times. Human ships landed in coral cities and coastal villages and mountain settlements, and everywhere they went, they found Verath who had given up hope suddenly remembering how to live. But not everything went smoothly. The dying star was unpredictable, sending massive solar flares without warning, and several human ships were damaged by radiation bursts before they could establish proper shielding. Captain Yuki Tanaka of the transport vessel Hokkaido was leading an evacuation in a northern city when the sky turned red with the light of a massive flare. "Everyone get inside the ship," she screamed, waving the crowd toward the boarding ramp. But there were too many people, and the ramp was too small, and hundreds of Verath were still exposed when the radiation wave hit. Tanaka did not hesitate. She ran down the ramp and began physically carrying Verath into the ship, her radiation suit alarm screaming warnings that she ignored. Her crew followed her example, forming a human chain to pass children and elderly Verath up the ramp as fast as possible. By the time the flare passed, Captain Tanaka had absorbed enough radiation to require immediate medical treatment, but every single Verath in her evacuation zone had been saved. "You are a fool," said the Defiance's chief medical officer as he treated her burns. "You could have died out there." "Then I would have died doing something that mattered," Tanaka replied, "and that is more than most people can say." Stories like this spread across the fleet, inspiring crews who were already exhausted to push even harder. Engineers worked around the clock to repair damaged life support systems, sleeping in shifts of 2 or 3 hours at a time. Pilots flew mission after mission through increasingly dangerous radiation levels, refusing to stop even when their ships began showing signs of strain. Medical staff treated radiation sickness and injuries and the psychological trauma of a population facing extinction, and they did it with smiles and kind words, because that was what the Verath needed. And everywhere, in every ship and every evacuation zone, humans repeated the same message. You are not alone. We are here. We will not abandon you. 3 weeks into the evacuation, a Vareth poet named Kethara asked to speak with Admiral Okonkwo. She was very old, perhaps the oldest Vareth on the planet, and she had spent her entire life writing verses about the beauty of her world. "Admiral," she said, her voice weak but clear, "I have a question that has been bothering me since your fleet arrived." "Ask anything," Okonkwo replied. "Why?" Kethara asked simply. "Why did you come when nobody else would? What do you gain from saving us?" Okonkwo was quiet for a long moment, considering her answer. "Do you know what fury is?" she finally asked. "Fury is anger," Kethara replied, "a destructive emotion that leads to violence and regret." "That is one kind of fury," Okonkwo agreed, "but humans have another kind, a fury that burns not to destroy but to protect, a fury that refuses to accept injustice even when fighting it seems impossible." She looked at the old poet with eyes that held both sadness and determination. "When we saw your ambassador begging for help, and we saw the galaxy turn its back on her, we felt that fury," she continued, "and we decided that even if we could not save everyone, we would save as many as we could, because that is what humans do when we see something wrong in the universe." Kethara was silent for a long time, and when she spoke again, her voice was filled with wonder. "I have lived for 200 years, she said, "and I thought I understood the galaxy, but I have never heard of a species like yours." "There is a first time for everything," Okonkwo replied with a small smile. The poet nodded slowly, and then she reached into her robe and pulled out a small crystal tablet. "This contains the complete works of Vareth poetry," she said, 10,000 years of beauty and wisdom. I would like you to have it, so that even if our world dies, our words will live on." Admiral Okonkwo accepted the gift with trembling hands, understanding the weight of what she had been given. "I promise you," she said, "your words will be remembered, and so will your people, because we are not finished yet." The evacuation continued, day after day, as the star grew more unstable, and the planet began to shake with earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. Human crews pushed themselves beyond all reasonable limits, loading passengers and lifting off and returning for more in an endless cycle of desperate hope. And slowly, impossibly, the numbers began to add up. 10 million saved, then 100 million, then 1 billion. It was not enough. It would never be enough, but it was more than anyone had thought possible. The fury of humanity burned bright against the dying light of Velkuth, and the galaxy watched in stunned silence. The star called Velkuth finally began its death scream on the 53rd day of the evacuation. Admiral Okonkwo was on the bridge of the Defiance when the alarms began blaring, and her science officer turned to her with a face pale with fear. "The gravitational cascade has entered its final phase," he reported. "We have less than 12 hours before the star collapses completely. Anyone still on the planet after that will not survive." 12 hours. They had planned for at least 3 more weeks of evacuations, and millions of Varath were still waiting on the surface. "Get me a fleet-wide channel," Okonkwo ordered, her voice steady despite the terror in her heart. "Every ship needs to hear this." She took a deep breath and activated the communication system. "Attention all vessels," she announced. "Our timeline has just been cut short. We have 12 hours to complete the evacuation and clear the system, so I need every ship capable of atmospheric flight to make one final run." She paused, knowing what she was about to ask. "This will be dangerous," she continued. "The radiation levels will be lethal for extended exposure, and the gravitational fluctuations may damage or destroy some of our ships, but there are still millions of people down there who are counting on us." The responses came back within seconds, and every single ship in the fleet volunteered for the final mission. "Then let us finish what we started," Okonkwo said, "and may whatever gods you believe in watch over us all." The last 12 hours of the Varath evacuation would become the most famous rescue operation in galactic history. 300 human ships dove into an atmosphere that was already burning, fighting through radiation storms and electromagnetic interference to reach the remaining population centers. Captain Diego Ferreira of the converted mining freighter Sao Paulo led his crew into the most dangerous zone of all, a coastal city that was being hammered by tsunamis from the destabilizing oceans. "We cannot land in those conditions," his pilot shouted over the roar of the storm. "Then we hover," Ferreira replied, "and we lower the cargo nets. Those people are getting on this ship one way or another." For 3 hours, the Sao Paulo hung in the sky above the drowning city, its crew working frantically to pull survivors out of the floodwaters. Ferreira himself went down on the rescue lines twice, grabbing Varath children from rooftops and carrying them to safety. "Captain, the star is getting worse," his engineer reported. "If we do not leave soon, we will not have enough power to escape the gravity well." Ferreira looked down at the city below, where thousands of Varath were still waiting for rescue. "How many can we fit?" he asked. "We are already at maximum capacity." "Then we find more room," Ferreira said. "Open the cargo bays, open the corridors, open every space that has air and a floor. We are not leaving until this ship is full." The Sao Paulo stayed for another hour, loading passengers into every available space, until people were literally standing shoulder to shoulder in the hallways. When they finally lifted off, the ship was carrying 3 times its rated passenger capacity, and Ferreira knew they had waited too long. The gravitational distortions caught them as they climbed toward orbit, shaking the ship like a toy in a giant's hand. Warning lights flashed across every console, and the hull groaned with stress it was never designed to handle. "We are not going to make it," the pilot said quietly. "Yes, we are," Ferreira replied. "Divert all power to the engines, including life support." "Captain, the passengers will survive for 10 minutes without fresh air," Ferreira interrupted, "which is all the time we need. Now do it." The Sao Paulo surged forward, straining every system to its breaking point, and for one terrible moment it seemed like the ship would tear itself apart. But then they broke free of the gravity well and shot into open space, and a cheer went up from every human and Varath aboard. They had made it. But not everyone was so lucky. The transport vessel Aurora was caught by a massive solar flare while loading passengers, and her shields failed under the radiation assault. Her captain, Sarah Okonkwo, the admiral's own niece, ordered all passengers to the protected inner compartments and then sealed herself in the engine room to keep the ship flying. The Aurora made it to orbit with every passenger alive, but Sarah never emerged from the engine room. "She saved us," whispered the Varath elder who had been the last to board. "She saved us all, and she did not even know our names." 17 human ships were lost in the final evacuation, some to radiation, some to gravitational anomalies, some to simple mechanical failure under impossible conditions. Their crews had known the risks, and they had chosen to stay anyway. The final ship to leave the Varath homeworld was the Defiance itself. Admiral Okonkwo had refused to withdraw until every other vessel was safely away, and she watched from her bridge as the planet below began to crack and burn. "Admiral," her communications officer said softly, "we are receiving a transmission from the surface. It appears to be from Varath, who did not make it to the evacuation zones." Okonkwo closed her eyes for a moment, then nodded. "Put it through." The voice that came through the speakers was calm, almost peaceful. "We know you did everything you could," the voice said, "and we want you to know that we are grateful. Tell the humans that the Varath will never forget what they have done." "I am sorry," Okonkwo whispered. "I am so sorry we could not save everyone." "You saved billions," the voice replied. You gave our species a future when everyone else had given up on us. That is more than enough." The transmission ended, and moments later the Defiance jumped to hyperspace, leaving the dying system behind. The Verath homeworld was consumed by its star 3 hours later. But 31 billion Verath had escaped, carried to safety by the furious determination of humanity. When Admiral Okonkwo finally stood before the Galactic Conquered Supreme Assembly, she was exhausted and grieving and angrier than she had ever been in her life. "You have violated 17 conquered protocols," the Supreme Chancellor announced, his voice cold and disapproving, "and you have acted without authorization in a matter that did not concern your species." "Did not concern us," Okonkwo repeated, and her voice was quiet but filled with barely controlled rage. "You heard Ambassador Yelthani's message. She asked if anyone in the galaxy cared enough to help, and we answered that call." "The situation was a natural disaster," the Chancellor replied, "regrettable but unavoidable. The Conquered had no obligation to intervene." "No obligation," Okonkwo said, and now she was not even trying to hide her anger. 40 billion people were dying, and you had no obligation to lift a finger. Is that really the legacy you want for this great civilization? She looked around the chamber, at the representatives of 800 species who had watched the Verath die without doing anything. "We lost 17 ships in that evacuation," she continued. "Over 300 humans gave their lives to save strangers they had never met, and you dare to lecture us about protocols." "The losses were unfortunate," the Chancellor said, "but they were the result of your own reckless decisions." "They were the result of your cowardice," Okonkwo shouted, and the chamber fell silent with shock. Nobody had ever spoken to the Supreme Chancellor that way. "You had the ships and the resources to help," she continued, "but you chose to do nothing because it was inconvenient, because it was expensive, because you had forgotten what it means to care about anything beyond your own comfort." She paused and took a deep breath, and when she spoke again her voice was calmer but no less fierce. "Humanity has learned something important from this experience," she said. "We have learned that we cannot rely on the Conquered to do what is right, so from now on, we will do it ourselves, whether you approve or not." She turned and walked out of the chamber without waiting for a response. Behind her, 800 species sat in uncomfortable silence, and for the first time in 12,000 years, the Galactic Conquered began to wonder if maybe they had made a terrible mistake. 20 years had passed since the dying star consumed the Verath homeworld, and the galaxy had changed in ways that nobody could have predicted. The rescued Verath had been given a new home on a beautiful moon called New Verath, located in human-controlled space, where they could rebuild their civilization in peace. At first, the survivors had struggled with grief and displacement, mourning the world they had lost and the billions who had perished. But slowly, with the help of their human friends, they had begun to heal. New cities rose from the fertile soil of their adopted moon, not coral structures like the ones they had lost, but something new and different, a blend of Verath tradition and human innovation. And the Verath themselves had changed, transformed by the experience of being saved when they had expected to die. The old poetry of acceptance and graceful surrender to fate had given way to new verses about hope and defiance, and the power of compassion. Young Verath grew up learning not just their own history, but the history of the strange, furious species that had crossed the galaxy to save them. They learned about human wars and human heroes, about the long struggle for justice and equality that had shaped humanity's soul. And they learned a new word, a word that had no equivalent in the old Verath language: hope. "Before the humans came," said Kethara the poet, who had somehow survived to see her people's rebirth, "we believed that the universe was cold and indifferent, that the only wisdom was to accept whatever fate decreed, but they showed us another way." She was very old now, the oldest living Verath, and she spent her days teaching young people about the evacuation and what it meant. The humans taught us that fury can be a form of love, she continued, that refusing to accept injustice is not foolishness but the highest form of courage, and we will never forget that lesson. The relationship between humans and Verath had become something unprecedented in galactic history. They were not just allies but something closer to family, bound together by the shared memory of those desperate weeks when one species had risked everything to save another. Human volunteers came to New Verath to help with reconstruction, and Verath scholars traveled to Earth to study human culture and philosophy. Children from both species grew up together, learning each other's languages and traditions, and friendships formed that would last for generations. But the impact of the Verath evacuation extended far beyond the two species directly involved. Across the galaxy, younger civilizations that had long accepted the conquered's cold philosophy began to ask uncomfortable questions. Why had they stayed silent when the Verath were dying? Why had they accepted the excuse of impractical when billions of lives were at stake? And most importantly, what kind of galaxy did they want to live in? A young diplomat from the Kelani people named Voresh was one of the first to publicly challenge the conquered's approach. "We have spent 10,000 years learning to suppress our emotions," she declared in a speech that was broadcast across 100 worlds. "We have convinced ourselves that compassion is weakness, and that cold calculation is the only path to wisdom. But look at what the humans have accomplished. They saved 31 billion lives through nothing more than stubborn refusal to accept the unacceptable," she continued. "And what did we do? We watched and calculated and did nothing." Her words struck a chord with species who had grown tired of the conquered's indifference. Over the following years, a new movement began to form, a coalition of younger civilizations who believed that the galaxy could be better than it was. They called themselves the Compact of Furious Stars, and their founding principles were taken directly from human philosophy. No species shall face extinction alone. The strong have a duty to protect the weak. Compassion is not weakness, but the highest expression of civilization. And the proper response to impossible odds is not acceptance but defiance. The conquered's elders dismissed the compact as a naive experiment that would collapse within a generation, but they were wrong. 20 years after the Verath evacuation, the compact had grown to include 47 species, and their combined fleet was nearly as powerful as the conquered's own. More importantly, they had proven that their philosophy worked. When a plague struck the agricultural world of Malvar Prime, compact ships arrived within days with medicine and supplies. When earthquakes devastated the Kelani homeworld, compact engineers helped rebuild the damaged cities. When a young species called the Tethkai faced invasion by pirates, compact warships drove the attackers away and stayed to help establish proper defenses. Every crisis that the conquered would have labeled, "not our concern," became an opportunity for the compact to demonstrate what civilization could be. Admiral Kira Okonkwo had retired from active service years ago, but she remained a symbol of everything the compact stood for. Now in her 80s, she attended the 20th anniversary celebration of the Verath evacuation as an honored guest. The ceremony was held on New Verath, in a beautiful garden that overlooked the sea, and representatives from every compact species had come to pay their respects. Okonkwo sat in a place of honor, surrounded by old friends and new allies, and she watched as a young Verath woman approached the podium. Her name was Yelthani the Younger, and she was the granddaughter of the ambassador who had sent that desperate plea for help 2 decades ago. More importantly, she had been born on a human transport ship during the evacuation itself, the first Verath to enter the universe as a refugee, now grown into a leader of her people. 20 years ago, she began, her voice carrying across the silent crowd. My grandmother asked if anyone in the galaxy cared enough to save us, and one species answered. She looked at Admiral Okonkwo with eyes full of gratitude and love. The humans came for us when everyone else had abandoned us, she continued. They sacrificed their ships and their resources and their lives to give us a future, and today we honor that sacrifice. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was stronger. But we do not honor it with words alone, she declared. We honor it by carrying their fury forward into the future, by building a galaxy where no species will ever face extinction alone, where compassion is not weakness but strength, where the proper response to darkness is always light. The crowd erupted in applause, and Okonkwo found tears running down her weathered face. After the ceremony, Yelthani approached the old admiral with a question that historians would remember for centuries. Admiral Okonkwo, she asked, why did humanity answer when no one else would? It was the same question the poet Kithara had asked 20 years ago, and Okonkwo had thought about the answer many times since then. She smiled, tired and proud and full of hope for the future. Because someone once told us that the stars were cold and uncaring, she said, and we decided to prove them wrong. We decided that if the universe would not provide compassion, we would create it ourselves. Yelthani nodded slowly, understanding the weight of those words. And now, she asked, now that the compact carries that mission forward, what do you feel? Okonkwo looked out at the gathering of species, humans and Verath and dozens of others, all united by a simple belief that the galaxy could be better. I feel like we have only just begun, she replied. The conquered has ruled for 12,000 years, but their time is ending. The future belongs to those who believe that every life matters, that every cry for help deserves an answer. She reached out and took the young Verath woman's hand. Your grandmother asked if anyone cared, she said, and humanity answered. But now it is not just humanity anymore, it is all of us, carrying the fury forward together. Above them, the stars shone down on a galaxy that was slowly learning to care about itself. And in the hearts of 100 species, the fire that humanity had kindled continued to burn, a light against the darkness, a defiance against despair, a promise that no one would ever be alone again. The fury of compassion had changed the universe. And this was only the beginning.